Hi, everyone. We'd just like to welcome you to our presentation. We're going to do. Hi, everyone. We'd just like to welcome you to our presentation. We're going to do a quick little exercise, and we can ask everybody to take out their cell phones. And I want you to go to your institution's Twitter feed. I want you to look at the last couple of posts from your institution and count on your hands how many people are people of color, are women, are people who don't look like yourself that you see on your social media feed. If you can kind of just raise your hand and give me if you see 1 or 2 or 3, I'm very curious to see. 2. Dogs. 5. So I want you to think about if you're a museum visitor and you're not seeing yourself represented in social feeds on an institution, how likely are you to go into the doors of that institution?
So I'm going to... Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting exercise. So I think I'm going to explore it from the standpoint of a unit at the Smithsonian, which is made up of many little units in that large whole, as one that isn't dedicated to facilitating history about minorities in the U.S. and how we're going about addressing that lack of diversity in our feed. So I don't know about you, but this is what the history of the Smithsonian looks like, and I don't even see myself represented in, in that picture. What you doing?
Sorry.
That's okay. Don't touch it. So my father's an immigrant, and I'm a woman. These people are, white males. They founded the Smithsonian. It's not something that I see a lot of commonality with. So I started to kind of crack that nut. This was years before the African American History and Culture Museum opened this past September, thinking about it from a female lens, and we have this amazing collection of the history of science in America. And there are all these groundbreaking women who had done completely fantastic things, but were unknown. I mean, I think if you think of a female scientist, you think of Marie Curie and maybe a couple others, and you're done. So, for example, this woman who's up in the corner with the bird specimen, she was one of our own scientists. She founded the field of forensic ornithology. She used to invite kids to come and prepare bird specimens at the museum, our National Museum of Natural History. She was responsible for getting birds involved in airplane strikes, identifying what birds those were, and then helping the airline industry adapt to have less bird strikes and improve air safety for everyone. We still have an active program in this. She did not have a Wikipedia page about 6 years ago. She founded a field in science and did not have a Wikipedia page. So I started some social media campaigns around Wonderful Women Wednesday, or Women in Science Wednesday, and now it's Wonderful Women Wednesday because we've expanded to include folks in the humanities as well. And this was only possible. Now, these women, there were not like large tomes of information in the archive. They were fairly undocumented in our collections as well. But we had a fellow who writes about the history of science, and she went through and cataloged each of these people with just some basic information. And what happened by just putting that tiny little bio out there, it has now grown to full Wikipedia articles, which we've hosted over 4 around the topic of women in science. So we are balancing the history of science. Because of this, and because I knew that in order to do Wikipedia, I got interested in the field of open glam, which is really looking at how we share our collections openly. I did a research paper I released last year at South by Southwest. These are the links to it. I'll tweet it out after my presentation. And I was looking at how the organizations that have gone open have fared over the last decade. But something happened. My daughter started going to Myrtilla Minor Elementary in Washington, D.C. It is our neighborhood DCPS school. These are her buddies from last year and still are her buddies. And It's a Title I school, which means that the majority of the students in the school qualify for free and reduced lunch. So a large low-income population. We are trying to invest in the school and try to raise the quality of education in that school, and part of that means committing as white parents to send your child there. I am being vulnerable in disclosing this to you. This is a very personal issue for me. It's something that has really hit home the issue of notions of what access is. So the school is less than 3 miles away from the Smithsonian's campus. We are large, we are free, we are open to the public. Do many of these children go? No. That hit me incredibly hard. What were we not doing to get these kids to feel like this is their institution? So, I talked to people who had tried to do it before, and I got answers like, oh, well, we gave free passes and, tickets on the metro and free lunches, and people just wouldn't come. It's like, come on, there's got to be something else going on here. And it's so obvious to my colleagues, but, I'm a white woman. What do I know? So I started to look at, there's this really interesting study. I think this is, I can't read it because it's so pixelated. It's the Mellon Foundation that looked at diversity in our workforce. This is completely plays out at the Smithsonian. The majority of our employees of color tend to work in the security, the service kind of sectors of the museum. That's not to say we don't have representation in other fields, but there's like an imbalance there. And I also think about all the interns I had, and we pay very little, right? So how can I can barely afford DC and I'm fully unemployed. How can we expect people to come and work with zero wage in a city that is incredibly expensive? So I started to kind of pick this apart, and I'm gonna disclose this to Lanae. I didn't plan to tell her this now, but she was really kind of like my mentor in a lot of ways in doing this, because I was kind of watching what she was doing and thinking about how I could kind of replicate it, but with a different, set of content. And so in honor of the opening of the African American History and Culture Museum, we took advantage of a pool fund and we examined our own racial history at the Smithsonian. We looked at how we have treated African Americans and how they've contributed to our history as the world's largest museum complex. And this was a really important project, I think, to think about how the Smithsonian has dealt with race in history, and some of our historians are incredibly honest about it. It is not a rosy picture always, but I encourage you to go to the Smithsonian Archives website and check this out. I've also started to partner on the Wikipedia edit-a-thons with different minority groups. We held kind of the Wikipedia Palooza with our Latino Center, with our American Indian Museum, with African American History and Culture, Asian Pacific. And we basically created a to-do list of minority women who weren't represented on Wikipedia. I think my favorite quote from that day was a woman who said she never knew how empowering it could be to write a Wikipedia article. And so I feel like this is an important step in giving people the tools to write their own history. We possibly can't do that all ourselves, but we need to facilitate that mentoring. And finally, something I'm working on right now, I'll tell you how it goes next year. I've hired a young woman who is in my local high school. This is our secretary's youth advisory council. He is formed a youth teen council to help advise us on what we're doing and not doing. And so I've hired one of these young people to come and co-develop a mobile experience for teen visitors at the castle. At the same time, our visitor services folks are going to kick off a teen docent program, which are going to pay teens in the area to come get experience in the museum field and welcome our teen visitors. So I'm sorry, I switched slides. I also can't undersell the need to just have this building on National Mall real estate. This is our new museum. It has changed the diversity of visitors on the National Mall, and that just is so exciting. That's kind of a segue to Lanae, but I just want to leave you with this quote. I'm not saying it is easy to do this work. It takes self-examination. It takes extra effort to put these resources out, but I think it is our responsibility as a field. There you go.
Oh, it did work. Yay. So some museums shy away, I think, from addressing topics like race, inclusion, and diversity, just because it's deemed too controversial. In 2010, the Center for the Future of Museums said that 9% of museum visitors were visitors of color. So then it became this big thing. How do we get people of color inside the museum field? We've been open, I think, for less than 35 days, and our grand opening hashtag was intentionally a people's journey. The idea was for anybody to feel like they could be included in our story, and also to use the stories of our museum to talk about their own family history. The campaign was highly successful. We had almost 1 billion impressions on Twitter. When we added in our YouTube, blog comments, et cetera, it came out to about 1.7 billion impressions. So we got about 43,000 people across the country and the world tweeting about our grand opening and who could see themselves reflected in our stories, even though our core content is African American. In addition, Pew just recently released a study that said that 28% of African Americans who use the internet use Twitter, compared to 20% of online white non-Hispanic Americans. That means for us, it was really important that we created a really engaging Twitter strategy to reach out to people. And a couple of years ago, I read this quote in an article from Portia Moore that said, what would happen if museums started to use their social media practice to become more inclusive to people of color? And I believe that museums can directly appeal to these audiences by developing strategies online through social media, through your website, and other digital properties that specifically target these groups. And this graphic here shows that online, African Americans overwhelmingly use topics to discuss race, social justice, et cetera. And that's one of the lanes that, as a museum, if you can start providing content that offers areas in those, that offers context for those areas, you'll be able to target a larger group of diverse museum visitors. In addition, this is a little graphic here that talks about Black Twitter. Twitter users, African Americans, are 12% of the US population, but they comprise 22% of online active Twitter users, and they really have the ability to drive Twitter conversations and Twitter hashtags. So oftentimes, I'm constantly online, I'm searching, I'm seeing what people are talking about, and seeing how, as a museum, we can insert ourselves into these conversations. And Black Twitter is just basically a loosely connected group of African American Twitter users who talk about issues relevant to that community, and again have the ability to drive conversations and hashtags. And I think the same way that we create content around the Super Bowl or et cetera, that you have the ability to create content around hashtags like Thanksgiving with Black families, et cetera, Black Girl Magic, Black Women Did that celebrate African American culture. This is an example from the Museum of the City of New York, using the hashtag Black Women Did That, showcasing an object from their collection that appeals to this user base. That's something that we do very often, and I was very excited to see a museum that's not a Black museum creating content around a hashtag driven by this Black Twitter audience. And then this is just a tweet that we use. This is actually an object that isn't in our collection, but is in the American History collection, and I was able to showcase that online. I think one of the key ways that, and I love this little boy, again, is to listen to these audiences online. There's a project called the Visitors of Tumblr Project, where people of color talk about their experiences in museum, why they feel that museums aren't approachable, why they feel like they're not included in these spaces, and I think that's a really important tool for us to use to listen to people. So it's difficult to be in some museum exhibits and not connect to the artifacts, to colonialism, genocide, rape, and murder. And that's from this woman here. And then this here is another quote as well, and I encourage you all to check out that project and see what people of color are actually saying about their own personal experiences in the museum. You can't really, I think, create content for a group of people if you aren't listening to what they want and what they need for your institution. Another tip, I think, is to share stories outside the common narrative. So you think about last summer, American History did a really big program. I think it was a 150th anniversary of the Star Spangled Banner. Don't quote me on the year. But they did a project that showcased the story of an enslaved girl who actually helped to sew that flag. And that's something that you don't often see. And that's just one way that museums can, again, add more context to anything that they're planning or talking about to include the stories of people of color. Maybe you're an art museum. You don't have a lot of art by African-American artists, but there's a way for you to tell the stories of maybe someone who helped mix paints or something like that so that people can see themselves in your museum. This tweet, I think my jaw dropped when I saw this tweet from Nat Geo Ed. And this is something that I think I've been seeing more and more on social media, is that a lot of cultural institutions, museums, et cetera, have been changing the game on how they interpret history. I think it used to be a very white-centered interpretation, and recently I've been seeing that that's been changing, and this tweet is just one of the ways. When I saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, to see this kind of interpretation from such a revered institution was amazing. And then this tweet here was something that I was proud to work on with my colleague who manages big brand social media. A couple years ago, I sent an email and I said, you know, I'm not seeing the stories of the people in my museum represented on the feed. I'm not seeing the stories of people at NMAI or our Asian American Pacific Islander Center or our Latino Center. How can we work together to make sure that you guys are also showcasing the stories of your sister institutions? And ever since then, I've kind of worked together with that team in creative ways. And this was one tweet that they sent out that actually linked back to an exhibition that our museum did a few years ago. But this is a tweet that you wouldn't have seen from the Smithsonian brand 5 years ago. So it's awesome to see that change happening in practice. And I like to think that we are changing the game and moving forward a little bit. And one thing I also noticed when collaborating with my colleagues from Big Brand is that they notice when they do, like we co-tweeted the Wiz Live airing on ABC. She said, we have really great engagement. I'm like, of course, because guess who's driving this conversation online? So they were really excited, and ever since then, we worked together on our grand opening strategy, and they've been really intentional about creating content that appeals to mass user bases through social media. Us being an African-American museum, African-American people are not monolithic. There are lots of different identities in our culture. And what I try to do through our social media practice is to share those different stories. So what we've done is that we share the stories of LGBT African-Americans. We share the stories of children. We share the stories of women intentionally, because there's not just one experience, even though we are an African-American museum. So this is just an example of some of our diverse practice, where we had one of our curatorial researchers write a blog about the history of voguing. If you're not familiar, voguing is a style of dance in the African-American LGBT community, to talk about this on one of our blogs. And people were so excited, again, to see themselves represented in this space. And even now in our current exhibitions, there are deliberate representations of African-Americans of varying sexual identities, and I think that's very intentional. Number 3, I think a good way that museums, a lot of you guys say, you know, we don't have any artists of color in our exhibition, or we don't have a lot of objects related to them. Great. What do you have online in your digital collection? Or are you using other resources like the Library of Congress to tell stories, again, that will showcase people of color and allow them to see yourselves in your feed? We have implemented a storytelling tool on our own website that allows people to get a more in-depth look at some of our object collections. And I think that through your digital collections, you're able to link and provide context and share stories that you wouldn't be able to necessarily do in your exhibition. So that's just another way for you to start thinking and looking at, and also looking at using different resources outside of your institutions to support those stories that you tell. So maybe you don't have an object, but you know, another museum has something that's related to your collection. This is another example of us using our digital collection online to jump on a hashtag trended by Black Twitter. And this is another tweet, Mall Histories with our opening. A lot of institutions have been sharing stories of people of color, and this is something that's really great, and I love this project that they're doing. Lastly, be open to criticism and adjust accordingly. We've all heard stories of museums who have unintentionally held programs or launched projects aimed at targeting people of color, but they've kind of missed the mark. Go back to number 2 and listen, see what these communities want so that you aren't providing something that they don't necessarily need. Lastly, praise makes you feel good, critique makes you better. This is a plug this weekend, if you guys want to continue these conversations, for the Cultural Heritage Social Change Summit, and that will take place on the Southern University campus here in Louisiana. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Recording.
I know quite a bit of institutions at the moment are getting into this dialogue of let's push the boundaries, etc. But what happens when, for example, I work at a cultural institution that is very visitor-driven, so the conversation is happening, but some of the members are a little bit more reluctant to being so exposed to criticism. There's going to be heavy criticism when you open deep conversations like this one. Can you give us some tips on how to open that dialogue with leadership that don't want to deal with that?
I'll say we have to think about what visitors will look like in the next 20 to 30 years. The majority of Americans in the United States will be people of color, and that's one way to spin it. The Smithsonian has launched an initiative to start targeting Latino audiences because that's going to be one of our core visitorships, and that's one way that you can look at that and sell it.
I think all of us get criticism, so I wouldn't worry too much. I would just kind of frame it in the cultural context that it's coming from.
So speaking as one of the 3% you noted in your presentation of Hispanic professionals in the museum industry, I really appreciate that acknowledgement of the percentages. But something that your presentation just sparked in me, there was a recent op-ed by John Leguizamo called Too Bad You're Latin. And I'd encourage everyone in this room, if you want to understand Latin audiences, to read this, breathe it, and incorporate it into yourself. But one of the things I've seen as a challenge for museum professionals when we talk about diversity, when we talk about expanding our focus and expanding our outreach, is for certain people and for certain communities, we stop history or we start history at a certain point. Like just in this city, just in Louisiana, 2 governors of this state, it was a territory then, Bernard Galvez and Alejandro O'Reilly are some of the most significant figures in Puerto Rican history, but they're also significant figures in the foundation of this entire country. Galveston is named for Bernard, and he led huge contingents of Puerto Ricans, guys that look like me, to fight against the British and support the American Revolution. Alejandro O'Reilly built El Morro Castle. We've had Puerto Ricans in the United States military since the Revolution, leading people in the Civil War. I have yet to see a Puerto Rican military exhibition that has dealt with Puerto Rican military history that isn't World War II or Korea. And that's just something that your presentation sparked me. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of brings up something for me. I think it's really important to, if you're coming from my perspective, have a mentor who can kind of, someone you can have an honest dialogue without feeling judged, right? And as someone in a minority group, you have to nudge, like kindly, but you have to nudge and get people to do that. So.
I apologize for having been late, so if this is redundant, please feel free to tell me to catch up offline. I was just wondering if in your practice you have invited outside groups in to use the collection, use the museum almost as a digital asset management system, as a set of raw assets, which they then adapt to telling their own stories, creating their own content in their own way. So it's not the institutional voices or staff members telling the stories, but people from outside coming in and building stories with the resources that are available there.
Let's see. We are launching a project soon that kind of does that, and we'll be doing more. So this is Adam here. He's our new Chief Digital Officer. So once we start hiring a staff, we aim to be a space like that. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you.